I'd like to introduce the keynote speaker, which is Kurtis Hewson. Kurtis has been a teacher, vice principal, and principal, as well taught at the post-secondary level at the University of Lethbridge and University of Alberta at the Faculty of Education. Kurtis received his BA and BEd at the University of Lethbridge and Master of Education at the University of Calgary with specialization in instructional leadership. In addition to 2 finalist awards from Alberta Excellence in Teaching Program and a recipient of the Alberta Edwin Parr Award for Excellence in his first year of teaching, Kurtis was one of the 3 honorees for the International ASDC Outstanding Young Educator Award in 2010. Kurtis is one of the 5 principals featured in Reflecting on Leadership for Learning, case studies of 5 Alberta elementary school principals, addressing exemplary leadership practices in elementary schools in Alberta. In 2015, Kurtis co-authored Envisioning a Collaborative Response Model, and in 2016 began working with Jigsaw Learning full-time, primarily focused on supporting districts and schools in the establishment of refinement of robust collaborative response model framework. Kurtis also worked with a variety of educational organizations in the area of leadership coaching and mentoring, strategic planning for systems, and facilitation for multi-layered complex initiatives. Through this work with Jigsaw Learning, Kurtis interacts with thousands of educators annually through Alberta and beyond. I would like to introduce Kurtis and my friend.
I want to take a little bit of time this morning to talk about what it looks like when we begin examining the layers of this work. When we think about collaborative response model and someone asks us, so what does that look like in your school? The response is usually not, oh, do you have a second? I can tell you about it. It's a little bit more like, do you have 20 minutes? Let's sit down because this is going to take a little while. As we start to talk about all of those layers in place. So I'm interested in the room and who's here. Let me hear from you if you traveled in this morning. Yeah, that's real enthusiastic. Let's try that again. If you traveled in this morning, all right. If you traveled more than 5 hours by vehicle, yeah, a little more tired, nice. If you flew to be here, excellent. And sorry, by fly, I mean not Fort Vermilion 150 down Highway 88. All right, let's jump right in. One of the great privileges that I have within the role that I play is being able to be in schools, to be able to interact, to be able to really engage in conversations about what does it really mean when we say we support all learners, and to think about how do we utilize that conversation to really build collective efficacy amongst our teams. So a couple of weeks ago, I had the great privilege to go out and see a school that's established an intervention block for their students. I knew that the block began from 12:15 to about 12:45, so I thought, show up around noon, we should be great to be able to see this. The email that I received back was, if you could come around 10:30, it's going to take a little while to explain what you're going to see. And so as that conversation began to unfold and the layers became apparent of what does this really look like when we're putting in place our interventions for our primary students in this grade, and how do we have some data that's being able to show the impact that we're having in a visual way that can really capture what people see. What are the resources that we've been developing over time so that we have a very strategic and systematic way to put those supports in place, and that way we have some assessment data that's guiding when we exchange and interact our students, we make those shifts, how the timetable's been adapted to build this in, and with each layer, your head just kept nodding with, okay, there's a lot to this half hour, right down to tags on kids' lockers so that they know where to go. And as soon as that bell goes for 12:15, boom, the place is in chaos for about a minute and a half until, boom, everyone's right where they need to be for that 30 minutes. This is one small component of a school's collaborative response model, but the layering behind it is massive. And it really took me back thinking about where this work and conversation began. So back in 2006, so let me give just a little bit of a understanding of the time frame just to take us back. So 2006, this gentleman, Paul Martin, resigned from the Liberal Party because he had been replaced by Stephen Harper of the Conservatives. There was a thing called the playoffs that the Oilers were in at that time. Sorry for any of the fans that have some deep-pitted connection to that particular photo that you see there. I'm pretty sure it's going to happen again. Brokeback Mountain was Best Picture of that year, and I have a funny story. I will always have a connection to this movie. My dad is a huge lover of Western films. And so when it comes to what should we get Dad for Christmas, at that time just got a little bit of a new TV system, and Mom decided, well, I heard that there's this great Western that's just come out. It's getting all sorts of awards and acknowledgments. That was probably one of the most uncomfortable 2 hours I've ever spent with my family members to watch what my mom assumed was a Western, which turned out to be quite a beautiful love story, but not quite in the same way that John Wayne may have imagined. 2006 was also the opportunity that had to begin engaging in this school. This is Claresholm Elementary School, which later became West Meadow Elementary, about an hour south of Calgary. This was a school with amazing teachers, really good teachers who loved kids, and everyone was working in their own silos. We were a staff that was incredibly collegial. Everyone was there to support and help one another. But when we say collaborate, we didn't have any type of structure or system in order for that to really maximize the heart and the expertise that was in that building. So we began to put some things in place. We took learning from professional learning communities, from some of the work around differentiation, thinking about what inclusion is going to look like as we're engaging in that provincial conversation. Response to intervention is just starting to gain some steam. How could we bring all of these pieces together? And as we were ready, firing, and sometimes aiming through this process, we began to see some benefits and some real results starting to come from it, not only from our students, but from our staff as well. We began to have some schools start to explore, and when you began to share all the layers, it became incredibly complex, and you could see people's eyes glaze over. And as you're explaining, you hadn't necessarily even realized how many different pieces were connecting within this. It was oftentimes far too complex to be able to share at an introductory level that people could make sense of how all these parts fit. They made sense to us, but it was because we had lived and worked through. So it became hard to explain it to others. So we needed a way to try and simplify. A gentleman by the name of Jeffrey Kluger wrote about this idea of simplexity. How do you take complex ideas and build them into simple understandings for us? But also understanding that through that simplification, there's a recognition that there's complexity within it, and a delicate interplay between complexity and simplicity. How can there be an entry conversation, but understanding that there's many, many layers to that work? That simplexity became what we began to describe as a collaborative response model. How we could work together to respond to the needs of students, but understanding this is not a program, it's not a series of steps that you take, it's a process, it's a model that everyone should be able to find a place within their educational context for what that is going to look like and how we could go through that. So in order to unpack those layers, it's so important that we understand that this work has phases. I know that within this room we have people at different stages of this work, some that are just coming in and joining the conversation, others that have been engaging for many, many years and seeing now where are our next steps to be able to go. But I want to take a moment just to share a recent understanding of what do the phases of this work look like. You'll notice that is not a straight line. There are dips, there are challenges, there are tiers. We're going to unpack some messy conversations through this work, and we need to have the courage to engage in that messiness as we go through. But let me describe what these phases typically look like, and I'd like for you to reflect on either where you currently could see yourself within this, or to possibly project out where are some of our next steps. So when we think about this first phase, it's really about building structure, building the framework in which we're going to be able to continue to build tougher, more challenging conversations over time. Within this phase, we often see as the initial trajectory starts going up, that people place attention on that collaborative meeting. How can we ensure that if we're coming together to meet, that that time is beneficial and really tapping into the expertise around the table? We see the development of some structures and some processes being put in place, that there's agendas, there's roles, there's pieces that we're going to establish at that first level. We're going to start building an understanding of the process and realizing that even within a school staff, we're not all going to be at the same place of understanding or even buy-in, and that's okay. We're learning as we go through, learning through this process and understanding that our focus goes right to the kids. How do we use that moral imperative that we have of we're here because we want to see children succeed, and how can we use that to leverage some collective conversations? However, there's a dip that comes fairly early. Many of you have lived through this dip. I need to tell you, this line is built on personal experience here as well. This first dip, we hear things such as, okay, great, when do we do this? When does this conversation happen? How are we going to build this in? There's a real focus on the logistics of should we get around the table? How do we get them together? How do we really make sure that this is a continuing conversation that has some merit for us? And we even hear one more meeting. Our educational lives are busy, and we've just introduced one more piece for us. Oftentimes, when schools have worked through that process, have thought through some of the logistical pieces, we again start to see that uptake, where one more time, we're going to start to see greater efficiencies in conversations. Where a few months ago, an hour-long meeting might be able to focus on 2, 3, maybe 4 children. We're now reaching out a place where we can have way more efficient conversations and get to the, so what are we going to do, question as quickly as possible. We see emphasis being placed on action. We're not coming together to vent or to discuss or just share our stories. We're really trying to get to, so what are we going to do? And seeing that, what is the steps we're going to take as a result of this conversation? We see an overall greater awareness of our students and trying to build in that our student approach over time. And we see the beginnings of utilizing some assessment information as part of the conversation, the infusion of a continuum of supports. We start to see those pieces come into place, and then we hit another dip. This dip I'm very familiar with. It's actually a dip that I would say at West Meadow Elementary, we never got fully through this dip, and I can own that and understand that now upon reflection. Here's what we see. We see the same students coming to the conversation. We see wheels spinning. We see people becoming frustrated that this is taking longer. Why can't we find the answer for this particular issue that we're potentially dealing with? There's not enough time to get through all of our students, the complexities that we have within our building, within our classrooms. We see supports really being able to look at the outside of the classroom, and typically a telltale of this is who's walking away from your meetings with the actions. Is it the administration and learning support, or is it the classroom teachers? Oftentimes at this level, it's coming there to get external supports outside of the classroom, which is great. Anywhere on this trajectory is probably having a benefit for children. But we, again, want to be able to envision what it would look like beyond this. We sometimes in this conversation see a focus on coverage and updating. Let's get through as many kids as we can. Let's cover as many as we possibly can, because we've heard that we need to be efficient and just, yeah, I see the check as we go through our kids. And this is a time where we can sometimes see disengagement in the conversation. And we're all good colleagues, but the student that's being discussed, I'm not really teaching that student this semester. I know it's part of our cohort, but that's really in your classroom, not quite in mine. We can see that levels of still a little disengagement. We especially see this at the high school level, where sometimes it's very difficult to bring everyone who interacts with that student being discussed to a common table. And how do we ensure, again, that this is a conversation everyone's benefiting from? I would suggest that this book, that looks familiar for many in the room, has done a good job, as it's been shared across the province, of describing what does it look like when you get started? How do we envision? Nowhere in there does it now talk about that next phase, where we are going into the area of building efficacy. How do you now use this structure to be more than just responding to students, but also building a sense of collective efficacy? The idea that we can make a difference. We can overcome a number of elements that are coming up as challenges, and even better, we have evidence that what we do makes a difference. Okay, that takes time and intentional focus, and I'm a strict believer now that this model is a highly impactful way to get to that place. So what we see at this next phase, as we begin this work of building efficacy, is that the focus in our collaborative team meeting conversations is all around what we term Tier 2 level conversations. Things that we could do at the classroom level that are really the focus for how we're able to respond within this particular conversation. And I'm going to come back and share how we layer these conversations over time with some examples. Also understanding that focus has some data depth to it, that there's some assessment analysis that's guiding that conversation. Not that we have this assessment data over here and a conversation over here. We're beginning to merge and mesh those together for us. We begin to see clarity that there's multiple layers of response within our school, and where is the best fit for a particular conversation? How do we maximize our structures to be able to ensure appropriateness of the discussion and focus for that time? We begin to really see the refinement of that continuum, not as an activity that exists in a Google Drive on a wall somewhere, but that it's really informing the conversation and the "so what are we going to do" conversation, and that we begin to see an alignment between the student-focused conversation and the collaborative work that happens as a result, that there's bridging between those. I'm going to forecast another dip that's going to come that we've seen some of our partners engaging and working through. And that dip within here is now where we begin to recognize that there's some lack of consistency in what we would refer to as our universal instruction. How do we ensure that there's clarity in our language, that when I say purposeful assessment, everyone knows what that means within our organization and can reflect upon it through a similar lens? We begin to see that perhaps our collaborative skill sets, how we engage with one another as adults, might not be ready for the push that's going to come in this conversation. The example I always use is the push of a conversation of saying, what if in your novel studies that you're utilizing, you use multiple texts at different levels instead of the one? Those are dangerous conversations sometimes for us as colleagues, and we need to not only make that acceptable, but expected. As part of this conversation, we have to push, and that our ego is going to set to the side for this with a high level of courage. That's not just the responsibility of an administrator or facilitator within a meeting, but that we all take that on for ourselves. That we see sustainability of structures and processes, that it does not rely upon a sole vision of a leader that's being able to move that forward, or a core team, that there's structures built that can exist beyond particular heroes or drivers of this conversation, and that we see the alignment of school and district processes. I would argue that a school engaging in this work without a clear district vision is only going to get to so far in these phases. There will be a level where we need a district alignment to be able, when we talk about the supports beyond what we can do at the school, there has to be some clarity in what that looks like. Now, I'm not even going to touch upon this morning some of these next phases, but I'm just going to provide a little bit of a glimpse of what this has looked like for some partners, when now this model becomes about how do we use it to transform practice. And by transform practice, I'm talking about how do we take our collective knowledge and really become agile in how we respond and support. How do we continue to innovate our instruction that's not following fads, but following what we're seeing in our own evidence and our own teaching practice? We begin to see a really deep understanding of what does our shared universal practice look like. Oftentimes we'll discuss what are the non-negotiables, that if we are engaging in instruction in this organization, these are the things that we know will exist in classrooms and still having an incredible degree of autonomy, which is what makes teaching exciting and what builds diversity within our organizations, but within a commonly understood framework of what that looks like. That we have aligned district processes that are timely and based on student and teacher need. That again, there's a high degree of agility for how we can respond quickly and through an informed way with not only at our school but district level. And we can comfortably, no, actually that's the wrong word, that we can appropriately engage in challenging conversations, that we can still be effective colleagues together, but we're going to push, we're going to challenge, we're going to utilize our norms to set some guidelines for, there's some behaviors that we will all agree to attend to, and that we have a deep respect for one another in the classroom while still being able to question what's going on for us. And then finally, having those clearly documented structures for what this can look like moving forward, so that there is a high degree of sustainability, and this is not just one more thing that we did a decade ago that's been recycled or set to the side as we move forward. I would argue that if we're utilizing a conversation about students to drive our practice forward, I don't think anyone can debate that. I think we can work through and discuss what that looks like, but the premise of it is incredibly sound for what we do as educators. Here's what I'd like for you to do. Take a moment at your tables. You're going to see a line going across. You're going to have 4 minutes to chat about, so where are you? What does this look like for you? Is there anything in the phases that I described that resonates or holds true for what it is that you're experiencing? I'll leave you for that conversation. 4 minutes, please. I think one of the things that's important as we're unpacking and thinking through the layers that I'm about to move towards for us is to understand that we can't fast forward to the next phase. Through this work, we can't say, oh my goodness, let's just forget the dips and get right over to phase 3. Let's start there instead. we understand, and I know we're going to see lots of nods around the table, is knowing that because this is a process, we have to live through these phases. We have to learn through it, which is why it's so incredibly important to understand that no school's model is going to look totally the same. There's going to be some guiding principles that are very similar that we talk about, and some key understandings or key elements, but how those are played out in each context is going to look different as we learn through each one of these phases. So here's what I'd like to do. I want to share 3 layers of Simplexity. I'm a big believer that if anyone's listening to a person talk, there should be the, oh my goodness, so what does this look like? So that it's not just theory and thought guiding us along. I want to share some examples of what it looks like as schools transition or systems from that first phase into the second. These 3 big ideas I don't believe are remarkable, but I think that they're things to consider as you project forward through this. First one, deepening norms. In order to get to what we talked about around having challenging conversations, we have to have a deep-seated ownership and understanding of how does it look when we do that. That's clearly understood by all of those around the table. So at phase 1, and it talks about it in the book, we establish those norms. They get shared at our team meetings. They get displayed. Here's a great example from Medicine Hat Public where it's displayed, table cards right there, even with a guiding question of, so now what are we going to do? To help remind how we're moving forward. Excellent place for us to begin the conversation. But if the norms are only displayed, poster, on an agenda, we start the meeting by just reviewing. Any questions? Great start. But now, as we think about deepening, how do we ensure that those norms are constantly being revisited and refined, that they truly become living and not a cursory exercise that is done because someone said you should do this as part of the process, but it really starts to drive us. This is an example from Lochern Elementary in Rocky Mountain House, where they were able to take their norms and be able to identify what will it look like and not look like, and then why. Why is that norm so important for us? And building that understanding together. This was not created by a committee after school. It was created through a messy conversation. This comes from Elmworth, a small K-9 or K-8 in Peace Wapiti School District, where you can see with their norms, they've purposefully laid out every year how they've revisited and enhanced. Take a look at the norm, a great guiding norm from September, and what it looked like in the following March. Okay? Getting to a greater level of depth on what we agree we're going to do during this time. Again, revisiting that conversation. I had the chance to go to Ekota School in Edmonton here on Tuesday, and as part of their meetings, they've identified not only for each of the norms what we will see, but what we'll not see, and have explicitly identified how they're going to behave. I've worked with a group of Edmonton principals where they've established their norms, and they've had discussions about what will we do when a norm is broken. Let's understand that. And for our norm that will arrive prepared and on time, they determined that if anyone breaks that, and let's be honest, someone's going to, we're a busy group of people, they determined that their response would always be to stop and ask, are you okay? And then second, have the person say, what's one commitment that they make to get here on time next time? Again, not in a way that's accusatory or shaming, but we know this is important for our conversation. Second big idea is understanding that the collaborative team meeting is only one conversation that we're having around students. I'm going to break down 3 different layers of team meetings and show how it connects within the model. So within phase 1, we establish those team meetings. We get them in place. We have a calendar. This comes from Savannah up in Peace Wapiti School District as well, where we lay out. I really love how they've laid out and not only determine when, but what's the focus. And it's tied to key measures that they're utilizing within their school in connection to their overall school plan. Great place to go. But now for them to for us to understand that as we layer, and build those collaborative structures, can we identify multiple conversations that happen about students? This comes from Robert W. Zahara, where they've laid out, here are the different ways we collaborate, who's involved, when does it happen, and what's its purpose. So let's break this down a little bit. As a school, in Claire's home, 2006, we had really strong structures for our high needs students, I would say. There were some really great things that were part of our IPP review and support process. We had the case conference element down really strong. But because that was our primary measure to talk about the needs of students, we moved a lot of students into that conversation that likely did not need to be there. We put some, let's be honest, we put some coding to some students that maybe was inappropriate, but it was because that was the one structure that we had to respond effectively to our individual students. When we brought in the collaborative team meeting, it added another level. Now, if the collaborative team meeting is our primary mode of discussion for students, what we'll sometimes see is we're bringing up very complex students to that conversation, which slows things down, which gets us bogged, which leads us to a, well, there's not much we can do until this, all these external factors get attended to. There's another layer within the middle of what I'm going to refer to as a school team meeting, what other schools have referred to as their intervention team or their school link team or their programming team meeting. The understanding is we're not going to be discussing Amelia necessarily in every one of these structures. If Amelia demands a conversation of a deep dive, really understanding what's going on and involving some external partners, let's not bring that conversation to our collaborative team meeting. That's better suited for our case conference meeting. So understanding the collaborative team meeting is really about what are we doing at tier 2? That next layer becomes what are we doing at a school level beyond the classroom? And that third level being what are we doing as an external when we involve our external partners here as well. Now you'll notice it doesn't say tier 2 kids. Kids are never tiered. The supports that we put in place are tiered. So these become the spaces where we talk about what layer of supports do we need to envision. I'm going to share what this looks like in practice, but understanding that very consistent with many of you have read or heard throughout this process, understanding the collaborative team meeting is every 4 to 6 weeks, typically monthly in our embedded schedule. That school team meeting is happening on a weekly to bi-weekly basis. Collaborative team meeting is talking about a wider expanse of students and what we could do at the classroom level, where the school team meeting is now starting to focus in on a little bit tighter group of students, and the understanding that our case conference is as students where we're going deep, and it's happening on an as-needed basis, which I don't think is unusual in any school context for us. Let's look at Medicine Hat Public, what it looks like in their system within their district. They recognize that the collaborative team meeting, the focus is on the classroom-based supports. It involves these particular individuals. It's noted how frequently and how long should that conversation typically be. Laid out clear structure for what I referred to as a school team meeting, what they refer to as a programming team meeting, what that structure looks like, and then also understanding what the case consult structure looks like. But understanding that there's spaces where conversations exist. And this last piece, I would say, is the biggest aha that's come over the last 2 years. And that's understanding that in phase 1, we established a conversation, an agenda for that conversation that's student-focused. We start off with some celebrations. We move to should we talk about first, and try and get to the so what are we going to do conversation as quickly as possible. Solid structure when I take a look at this meeting agenda, but again, very action-focused, a great collaborative conversation that's student-focused for us. But when we move on to this next phase of being able to use that conversation to build efficacy, we see an agenda that becomes focused on key issues. All right, Clearview Colonies, let me hear you. If there is any context that says we cannot collaborate, it would be colonies. When there is a teacher, maybe an educational assistant, maybe a German teacher that's part of that. But when we come together as teachers, how could we possibly collaborate when I want to talk about Esther and no one else in the room knows who that is? Here's what their enhanced agenda looks like. We start off, we review some norms, some celebrations. Then we're going to have a discussion of our alerted students. We come ready with a student and identify a key issue. Okay, key issue for us in that conversation, and we engage through that process. Then we do leave some space for us to talk about any other additional, so that we've kind of married those conversations for us. But when we identify a key issue related to a student, it drives the conversation to a new place for us. Again, I wish I would have understood this 6 years ago because it would have made a tremendous impact in our conversations. Connaught School in Medicine Hat, teachers come ready with a pre-organizer where they've identified not only a student that they're intending to celebrate, but a student that they're concerned about, a key issue, and some data that tells them why they think that's a key issue. Again, very quick. This is not meant to be teacher homework or add one more onto our pile. It's just helping us get ready for that conversation. One of the things I absolutely love within their pre-meeting structure is it's not just at risk. We want to bring to the conversation a student we want to challenge or extend. And a key issue might be the use of an enhanced descriptive writing technique such as metaphor. That's what is a next step for this student. Here's an example. This is Medicine Hat High, where once they've identified a key issue, everyone in the room identifies a student who has a similar key issue. They discuss what they're going to potentially be able to do, and then each teacher commits to one thing they'll try in their classroom that they're not currently doing for it. So this is what that conversation looks like. As a facilitator, we ask, all right, our focus today is around engagement. Who's first? Who's the first student? And we have Charity. I'm really worried about her. She's disrupting others in class. Excellent. Let's drill down to what's the key issue behind that. Why is that happening? Well, I think she's having trouble getting started on her own, being able to work independently. All right, excellent. Any other students that are having a similar concern? Maybe not to the same severity as Charity, but dealing with something similar? Great. Now, what are we going to do? And we start brainstorming. We don't say, maybe you could, maybe you could. It's, what could we do? And then allow teachers to own it, to say, all right, for Charity, one of the ideas I heard that I think I can take back is this. Someone else can say, for the student I identified, I don't think that would work in my classroom, but this other idea could. Where, again, the conversation is around the supports, using the student to leverage that conversation, but not everyone in the room doesn't have to understand the child, their background, their family history, in order for us to talk about the key issue. When we focus on just the student in the collaborative team meeting, I would argue you have to focus on the student in the school team meeting and obviously in the case conference layer. But at a collaborative team meeting layer, when we focus on the student in that context, we often see lengthy descriptions begin to dominate. Everyone has to share a war story. I need to let everyone know what I know about this child. Oftentimes, multiple variables can come into play, and all of a sudden, this conversation has become this big for us to try and attend to. Oftentimes, once we've done that, it leads to a focus on things outside of our locus of control, which effectively can limit our sense of collective efficacy. Oh, there's not much we can do until the parents do this, until I get more funding for this, until the district does this, until society. No, there's lots we can do when we focus on key issue. When the focus becomes the key issue, now we can attach multiple students. I don't need to necessarily know the students being discussed because I'm talking about the issue in relation to those students. We can now engage in a, so what could we do? Let's engage all of those possible solutions for us and really begin a what if. What if we tried this? Yeah, I know putting anchor charts on the wall is great, but what if we put them on a ring that the child could carry from classroom to classroom. That's a great idea. What if we put it onto their iPad so they could access? It lends itself to a conversation that is about innovation and thinking more deeply about what we could do within our practice. That is what's going to build our collective efficacy. And as we see evidence that what we're trying is taking impact, maybe not even for the particular student that we were first concerned about, but for others along the way. So thinking about those three next layer steps, here's what I'd like for you to do. I'd like for you on the Post-it notes that you have on your table, identify what's one thing that you're looking to learn more about through the next 2 days of conversation. Identify that one thing. I'm going to give you 1 minute at your table to share with others what that one thing is before we bring to closure here for this morning. All right, I'd encourage you as you set out over the next 2 days, as you walk out of this room, on the doors there's a sign for the parking lot. Please post your Post-it note there. If you would like someone to try and help walk or talk through that with you, feel free to leave an email address on that, and someone from our team, either during conference or after, will reach out to maybe touch base around those. Please leave them as you exit the room. I'd like to thank you for your attention. I'm going to turn it over to Cheryl here, but enjoy your learning. Engage with your colleagues, and I wish you all the best over the next 2 days. Thank you very much, everyone.